Australia, and welcome to the Australian Mental Toughness in Education webinar on this beautiful sunny afternoon in Sydney. It's Wednesday, March the 29th, 2017. My name is Paul Lyons. I'm from Mental Toughness Partners, and I'm your host this afternoon. And in this webinar, we're going to feature 4 accomplished and experienced mental toughness practitioners, and we'll be discussing and sharing ideas around mental toughness. It's essentially sort of what it is, where it comes from, why it's important, and how it's used in the UK education system, and how it might be used in the Australian education system. Before I introduce our guests, some quick housekeeping. So first of all, we'll probably run for about an hour. So we'll aim to finish in Sydney time about 5 o'clock. The first 45 minutes or so, we'll have some presentations and discussions amongst our guests. And then the last 10 or 15 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for questions from your audience. So if you have questions, please send them through via your screen. And if I can ask you, please, just to keep your microphone and your video switched off, just so that we avoid any interesting sound effects or video. So rather than me do the introductions, I'm going to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves, and then we'll start with a presentation from Doug on mental toughness. But I might go to you first, Doug, just to give a quick introduction to yourself.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to everyone. Unfortunately, it's not sunny here. It's the middle of the night here, so we don't yet know whether we'll have sun. But I'm Doug Straharczyk, and I'm the CEO for AQR International. And the mental toughness is a subject that we've worked on for almost 25 years with Professor Peter Clough, who is now probably recognised as a leading authority around the world on the topic.
Thank you, Doug. I was looking for Steve, but I can't see Steve. Susie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Hi, Paul. Hi, Doug, and everyone else. I'm Susie Green. I'm the founder of the Positivity Institute based here in Sydney, Australia. And we run, some of you may know, we've actually had an overwhelmingly positive response to the webinar. So we are a boutique consulting company, and we do work on applied positive psychology for the enhancement of wellbeing, resilience and achievement in schools and in workplaces.
I'm trying to watch a webinar, and I don't know how to get the sound. It's my new laptop.
Hi, Belinda. It's probably in the bottom left of your screen. There's a microphone. If you're able to switch that off. There we go. Thank you, Susie. And Steve Oakes, also from the UK.
Can you hear me, Paul?
Definitely can.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name's Steve Oakes. I'm Director of Education at AQR. I've been working at AQR now for the last nearly a year, actually. Prior to that, I've done 17 years as a teacher, 4 different schools, mainly focused on post-16 education towards the end of my career, but I've been working with mental toughness in schools for probably about 10 years now.
Thanks, Steve. We'll look forward to talking to you a bit later on. And Steve Azamudis.
Yeah, thanks,
Steve,
Paul. So I'm the Principal Consultant at Sage Learning and Development. Came across the MTQ 48 a couple of years ago at an Australian Psychological Society conference, and along with yourself and Susie, involved in training people up to work with it, running assessments and facilitating workshops. So they're the 3 sort of pillars to our business, doing the assessment piece, coaching for development, and then facilitating workshops as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And we look forward to talking with you later on as well. So that's our very, very experienced panel. And we're now going to introduce Doug back to just give us an introduction to mental toughness. So over to you, Doug.
Thank you very much, Paul. Right, if people would just bear with me for a second, I'm going to just get a slideshow up. Oops. Hopefully everybody can see that. So we're going to talk about mental toughness. There's a brief introduction. We're going to talk about its importance in the world of education. And as Paul said, we have managed to get people interested in mental toughness in schools in the UK for about the last 15 years. And it's certainly got a lot of momentum. I think it's fair to say it's probably the most important development of its type in schools in the UK. But we've not confined our attention to the UK. In fact, we're working with perhaps almost 80 countries around the world, taking the concept out into schools and into youth work. The two are very often closely connected. So, firstly, what is mental toughness? The technical definition is it's a personality trait which determines in large part how young people deal with challenge, opportunity, stresses and pressure, irrespective of circumstances. Sometimes I'll explain the significance of the word toughness in a moment, but sometimes it's quite useful to think about mental toughness as mindset or attitude. But what we do know is it's a personality trait, and it's a personality trait which describes and defines how people think. Most people think of personality as being largely about behavior, and that's how we act, but this is very much about how we think, and essentially about why we behave the way we do. So it's fundamentally important in its own right, but it's actually really important if we're trying to look at changing behaviors in some way. The term in large part means it seems to explain a lot. It doesn't necessarily explain everything. There isn't a silver bullet here, but it does seem to explain a lot of what's going on in the minds of people, especially young people. And irrespective of circumstances really answers a question that one or two of you may have wanted to ask, but we get asked a lot, so we anticipate it. People will say, but I behave differently at home than I do at school or I do at work. Well, you may behave differently, but the way you think doesn't change. So what do we know about mental toughness? Well, there are now 80 plus research papers on mental toughness, many of them focusing on the world of education. And what we know is that it seems to be the key to aspirations, achievement, well-being, and positive behavior. These are all reliant on the way we think. Now, sometimes people look at the word toughness, they don't like the word toughness. Interestingly, when we're working in health services, they're not terribly keen on the use of the word mental. But when we talk about mental toughness, it's not about being macho, domineering, aggressive. And sometimes people think it's a male-dominated concept. It isn't. It's about toughness in the resilient sense of the word. So it's about being the best you can be. It's Peter Clough, who we've worked with for many, many years, now uses the phrase, it's about being comfortable in your own skin and accepting that life can be difficult and it's sometimes full of opportunities as well as threats, but it's about being able to recognize those opportunities and act on them. So you can see there's a very strong positive theme in mental toughness, and it corresponds very closely to a lot of the work that goes on, for instance, in positive psychology. Now, we've approached the subject of mental toughness not from the mindset's perspective. There's a lot of really interesting and useful work being done, particularly in the States, from people like Carol Dweck, who look at mindset, Seligman, who looks at learned optimism, and Duckworth, who looks at conscientiousness or grit. We've actually come to the position where we are from the health world, which is where resilience is an important concept, and from the sports world. In fact, the term mental toughness was coined in the sports world. And so there's a number of important concepts running around. And what I think we've done, which is quite unique, is we've been able to develop a framework, or Peter Clough's been able to develop a framework, which embraces all of these ideas into a concise and clear, and it seems to us a fairly complete framework. And not only have we got the framework, we've now got the tools to be able to assess people within that framework. And of course, Steve will also talk shortly about, well, can we do anything about the mental toughness of individuals? Well, the answer is we can, and we've got a lot of evidence to show that you can actually change the mental toughness of individuals if that's a desired outcome. But we talk about mental toughness having 4 components, which we call the 4 C's. That's control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. And these, when they're combined, provide an overall measure of mental toughness. Now, it's important to say at this stage that the opposite of mental toughness is not mental weakness. It's mental sensitivity. And it's mental sensitivity in the sense that a mentally sensitive individual will allow events to get to them. In other words, they're very sensitive to events, especially negative events. And that will often stop them in their tracks. It will stop them in their tracks for a long period of time. It might even stop them in their tracks permanently. A mentally tough individual seems to be able to just take these same events in their stride. And that's essentially the difference. Fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with being mentally sensitive. That's just the way you are and the way you want to live your world. But what we do know is that the mentally tough seem to be able to achieve more and to achieve this more easily than a mentally sensitive person. So the issue for mentally sensitive people is there's nothing wrong with being mentally sensitive. The journey you have to travel is just going to be a harder one. And whether you are mentally sensitive or mentally tough, the key is self-awareness. And that's really the whole purpose of this presentation. And to be honest, the whole purpose of our work is to ensure that people are self-aware about this important quality and then can do something about it. So if we were to summarize what the 4 C's are, well, the 4 components of mental toughness are control, commitment, challenge, and confidence. We know that the control scale has got 2 elements. One is the sense of life control, and this is really where the sense of can-do sits. This is where an individual has a sense of their self-worth. If they have to do something, they have a mindset to be able to understand that they can do it. The other element of control is emotional control. And this is really about being able to manage your own emotions and the emotions of people around you. So for instance, in a school setting, if a group of pupils suddenly is in a poor mood or a bad mood, if you've got a low level of emotional control, you'll get sucked into that. If you've got a high level of emotional control, you won't get sucked into it, and you may even be able to do something about the mood of the people around you. You'll certainly try. The second element of mental toughness is commitment. And this corresponds very closely to what Duckworth talks about when she talks about grit. Peter Clough describes this as stickability. We often say this is largely about the extent to which you make promises and the extent to which you set goals for yourself and the extent to which you'll do something about achieving those goals and keeping those promises. So it's got 2 elements. Firstly, there's goal setting, and that's about, is your mindset to set goals? Do you set goals for the things you have to do? In other words, if somebody asks me to do something, am I likely to say, well, fine, I'll do it, and I want to do it by Friday, I want to do it to this standard, and I want to leave myself free with a little bit of time to make sure I've done it right. So people who are goal-orientated tend to be very good at doing lots and lots of tasks. They tend to be very good at planning, prioritizing, and organizing. It's really one of the things that helps them to be goal-orientated, but it's also, we're beginning to understand, one of the main sources of motivation. Hitting that goal is the driver for a lot of people. But of course, we all know people who will set goals, and we all know pupils who will set goals, but then won't do anything about it. So the other component of commitment is achievement. And that's essentially where an individual decides whether they'll do whatever it takes to keep those promises and hit their goals. And that'll involve things like perhaps even being self-sacrificing, being prepared to work very hard and very long, but I'm determined to hit those goals. Now, when we look at these subscales, the subscales are important in their own right, but quite often they are important in another way. They interplay with each other. So for instance, we can see people who will set goals, but then won't do what it takes. We actually see people who won't necessarily be goal orientated, but when they're given goals by other people, seem to be extremely conscientious and get on with it. So there's an interesting interplay between these two scales. There's almost an infinite number of permutations. And that's where the model becomes important, and especially where the measure becomes important, because we can assess this and actually drill down to find out what it is that is either holding an individual back or actually helping them to achieve. Now, the control and commitment scales approximate to what most people would describe as resilience. So there's a very close link between the concept of resilience and mental toughness. But resilience, in one sense, is a passive quality. Most definitions of resilience will say resilience is the ability to recover from an adverse situation. And that simply means that something's happened, it hasn't worked, but you can pick yourself up and dust yourself off. And essentially that's down to those two elements that I've just described. A sense of can do, I can still do it, and commitment, well, I'm still going to try and achieve what I was going to achieve. Now, the issue with resilience is that you can be resilient because you have to be, or you can be resilient because you want to be. And we understand that now because a researcher in North America called Cabasa was looking at resilience, and she discovered that very difference. She discovered that there were individuals who somehow not only were resilient, but would quite often deliberately put their resilience into play. And she called this challenge, which is the third component of mental toughness. And essentially, challenge is about being open to taking risks, being open to stretching yourself, being open to pushing yourself, being open to new situations, new ideas, sometimes to the point of creating change. So challenge is about an openness to change. Challenge, though, we've learned from our most recent research, has two elements itself. The first one is risk-taking. And this is where somebody who's got a high level of challenge, especially on risk-taking, is somebody who will push themselves. They'll always be curious, they'll always be pushing themselves. They don't mind stepping into the unknown because there's something to be learned there, there's something to be gained from going where you've never gone before. However, there's another element to challenge, and that's learning from experience. So some people, when they'll push themselves, just by the very nature of taking risks, they'll find that some things will go wrong, some things will go right. If you're more of a risk-orientated person, you'll have a few more things going wrong than most people will. Some people respond to that negatively, saying, well, I tried that, it didn't work, I'm never going to do that again. We actually see that a lot in a lot of our occupational work in organisations. However, others will respond quite differently. They'll say, well, I tried that, it didn't work, but I've learned something from that, I'm going to have another go. I think I know how to do it better next time. So the second component of challenge is learning from experience. So mentally tough individuals will even see setbacks and failures as opportunities for learning. So we're beginning to understand in a lot of our work that the challenge scale is very, very important, especially in the world of education, because in a sense, this is where openness to learning sits. Then the final component of mental toughness, and this is where Peter Clough's big contribution came, where he understood what the missing element was and how it all tied together. The fourth component is confidence. And this is really about self-belief. And this has got two subscales. Firstly, confidence and abilities. And that's simply my self-belief that I have the ability to do what I need to do. or that I can go and comfortably acquire that ability. The other element is interpersonal confidence, and this is about influencing others as much as they influence me, being able to stand your ground. But one of the most important applications we've found in the world of education is people have got a reasonable degree of interpersonal confidence and not afraid to ask questions. And we've done quite a little bit of work which shows that if a pupil sits in a class, doesn't understand what the teacher's saying, or doesn't agree with what the teacher's saying, if they're not prepared to put their hand up and ask a question, then they don't necessarily learn. If they just sit there and they're too embarrassed or too frightened to ask that question, they don't learn. So those are the components of mental toughness. It's a very brief run through about what each of the elements mean. So you can see there are 4 key components, and each of those components has got 2 subscales. What that means is we can dig down to quite a degree of detail when we're looking at the mindset of an individual, and dig down in quite a useful way. Not only can we have information about each of the scales, but we can look at the interplay between those scales. Now, can we measure mental toughness? Well, Steve and Paul have both mentioned the MTQ-48. In 2002, Professor Clough managed to develop a high-quality psychometric measure that's had 48 questions, which enables us to assess most of these qualities. We'll shortly, perhaps by the year end, have the ability to assess all of those subscales. But if you look on the screen, you'll see what a summary report would look like. So this is, say it's a student, their overall mental toughness score is, you can see at the top of the screen, is 6. Mentally sensitive individuals would typically score 1, 2, 3. Mentally tough individuals would typically score 8, 9, 10. But 68% of the population basically is normal or would score around 4 to 7. So most people score 4 to 7. And the challenge is, can we shift them a little bit to the right? Is there a benefit in shifting them to the right? And if we have to shift them to the right, where do we need to do that? And if we look at the profile, we can see it isn't a straight line. There are highs and lows. You can see that confidence and abilities is high. This person, in terms of confidence and abilities, is mentally tough. It's got a strong sense of self-belief. But curiously, their interpersonal confidence is comparatively low. So you could look at an individual and come to a view about their confidence, but actually we can drill down a little bit more deeply and see that their interpersonal confidence is lower, much lower than their confidence and abilities, and that this kind of imbalance might mean that, yes, they've got the highest sense of self-belief, but actually a little bit too timid to do anything about it. And so we can look at the interplay between all of those scales and come up with some really powerful and useful insights. Now, what else can we do with the data? Now, we've spoken so far about working with individuals, but we're beginning to find schools and organizations using the data in a group sense. So this is an example. In 2016, we were commissioned to do a study in 58 schools on 9,000 young people. And you can see what the overview response was. What we were able to do is assess the average mental toughness of students across years 5 to 13. That's in a UK curriculum. That probably approximates to grade 5 or grade 6 through to grade 13 in Australia. But what emerged was really, really interesting. So you can see that in the UK, years 5 and 6 are what we call junior education. Mental toughness scores were quite high. Then year 7 is usually the first year into secondary education, and we can see a slight dip. To be honest, we would expect that because the effective transition is sometimes to affect the mental toughness or sometimes the confidence of individuals going into secondary school. But then what we found was that that dip then continued in years 8 and years 9, and it was a very significant dip, and then slowly began to rise. Now that's given us an insight. That's really caught the attention of educators here, because in the world of education, people have understood that in early adolescence, there can often be something that's called the lost years or the wasted years. But here we have really solid evidence about it. And we don't have time to show it in this webinar, but what we've been able to do is say, well, does this happen for each component of mental toughness? And the answer is it doesn't. It only affects certain components. The other question was, is it the same for males and females? We were able to show that the dip is less pronounced for males generally, and much more significantly pronounced for females. We can debate this endlessly, but what this is beginning to introduce into the world of education is the ability to assess and measure some important aspects of the world of education. Another example here, and so far we've spoken about impacting on pupils. Most of our work indicates that the mental toughness concept is equally applicable to staff. In fact, generally, there's a strong correlation between the mental toughness of staff and the mental toughness of pupils. And maybe that shouldn't surprise us, but we are, sorry, in the middle of a major project in the UK. It's a 5-year project working in an area called Blackpool that's got significant problems. It's an area of quite severe deprivation and where pupil aspirations is very, very low. And part of the programme is to lift aspirations and lift achievement in the area. But this is the data from the initial cut. So the first thing that's happened is that roughly 3,400 young people were assessed, and the teachers that worked with them were assessed. And you can see that the results for young people were quite low, much lower than average. So for instance, the overall mental toughness score for pupils was 3.3, when the UK average emerges around 4.1. But then when we look at staff, we see some interesting elements of the profile. If you look at interpersonal confidence of staff is 5.1, where the UK norm is 5.5. Literally, if we were to go out and test 520 people on the streets in the UK, we would expect to get a score of 5.5. And yet the interpersonal confidence of the average teacher isn't as great as that. And then if you look at challenge, which I've already described as openness to learning, that too is low. And then if we look at emotional control, that too is low. So what we've been able to do is see there are potential explanations in staff that correlate with and can perhaps explain what's happening with pupils. So it's not, we can look at pupils from the round, including their environment, and of course, staff are a key part of that environment. So I think I'm going to just stop there, Paul, because I think I've explained what mental toughness is and I've explained how the measure works.
Thank you, Doug. That was a really interesting insight. I really appreciate that. It was really thorough and gave us a really good, as I say, insight into mental toughness. I'm just wondering if I can bring in Steve Oakes now. And Steve, you've obviously worked as a teacher, as you mentioned earlier on. And I'm wondering if you can give us some practical insights to when you've used MTQ 48 and mental toughness in your schools.
Yep, sure. What I was going to do is just talk through, because the question I get asked most commonly is, how do you actually set this up in a school? How do you actually get it running? So I was just going to talk through that, if that's okay.
That's fine. Just
going back to what Doug was saying, one of the reasons mental toughness is getting so much attention in the UK schools at the moment is 2 reasons. One, partly because a lot of schools have been finding that they've only been addressing part of the problem. So when they've been doing what quite often gets called character development programs, they might just have been looking at growth mindset, grit, or resilience. And what they're finding is that mental toughness is an umbrella term that you can use that covers all of those, and they can all be mapped across. So it gives your program much more depth. The second reason is that the mental toughness program, you have the model, you've got the measure, and you've got the toolkit. So again, you seem to have you've got a full program that you can use within your school. So as Doug said earlier, in terms of setting this up in school, Doug said there's no silver bullet. And the other thing to keep in mind with mental toughness is that it's not a quick fix. This is something that takes time if you're going to embed it in any organisation, whether that's a school or within business. So, and it takes some thought about how you're actually going to structure and plan to implement that. So I'll just talk you through the way that, from my experience, the way that I've found it works quite well. And obviously we can take questions on that later on. First of all, I think it's important, the step one is to start with staff training. And what they've found in the UK with a lot of the research that has been around growth mindset or grit or resilience programs is that one of the reasons they're not being successful is that the staff don't fully understand the model that they're working with. So there's a bit of a drive to go straight to interventions and toolkits without staff really understanding how they can make explicit the learning, because they don't understand the theory behind what they're actually trying to deliver. So some research recently on growth mindset, for example, they found when they asked the staff what growth mindset meant, very few of them could actually explain it, yet they've been working on a toolkit with kids for about 5 months. So the staff training is important for two reasons. One is it helps them to develop their understanding of the model, the measure, and the toolkit. But secondly, obviously, it gives them an opportunity to develop their own mental toughness. So step one is about developing staff awareness of the model and themselves. Step two, I would suggest, is about setting up a pilot within the school. So we found that going whole school immediately isn't always the best plan. So to set up a pilot where you're going to test the intervention in your specific context. So the way that we generally structure that is we'd obviously start by identifying a cohort of pupils that you're going to work with and then get them to complete the MTQ 48. So again, rather than just blanket pupils with a intervention, having completed the mental toughness questionnaire, what that allows you then is to very specifically look at your context and look at the areas that you might feel that you need to develop. So step one, staff. Step two, identify your cohort and put them through the measure, look at the data. And then step three is we've been developing a toolkit now for probably the past 5 years or so, where we've got around, depending on which sector we're looking at, 40 to 50 different practical tools that can be used in the classroom to help develop mental toughness. So the next step is, once you've sat down and looked at your data, we found that you can then match the tools to look at that specific cohort. So the way that we do that generally is you need three things. You need the pupil data, you need the calendar for the school, and you need the toolkit, and obviously a group of people around there that know that particular cohort. And then it's just a case of identifying, okay, based on our data, these are the areas that we need to work on. Looking at our school calendar, these are the hotspots that pupils might be going through. So they might have mock exams at a certain point in the year. So you might be able to structure the tools so that you do some work on stress management just before they actually do the mocks, and then afterwards, after the exams, when they get the data back on how they've done, you might do some work on how they bounce back if the results haven't quite gone as they hoped. So you can structure the year, put in the toolkit, and then obviously it's a case of getting the staff to then deliver the program. One of the biggest questions we have is how long will this actually take to deliver in school? So we worked on the idea that really in UK schools, if you ask for any more than 10 minutes initially, schools find that quite stressful, the fact that they might have to find so much time to deliver the program. So all the tools can be delivered or the activities can be delivered in around a 10-minute slot. And in the UK, what they're finding is that that's best delivered in the tutor time. So every day, the students go to their tutor. They usually do a registration followed by a 10 or 15-minute period where they get to work with that tutor on different activities, and that happens every day. So we're just saying maybe do one of these activities each week where you focus on an element of mental toughness. And then it's a case of running that program really for as long as you can, because again, one of the concerns about a lot of the programs around growth mindset and grit that are being delivered is that they're very short. So they're only being delivered in 5 or 6 week blocks. And certainly I would argue that if you're going to change behaviours and habits and the way people think, that is actually going to take much longer to do that. You need to do these activities frequently, repeat them. We encourage schools to develop a spiral curriculum, so they're building on the work as they go through the year and through the years in school. So the next stage is, once you've obviously delivered your pilot, you then can post-test your pupils, redo the mental toughness questionnaire, look at the distance travelled, look at the data to see if your programme has had any impact. And then you've got the data to then go to the rest of the school and say, look, this is what we've trialled, this is how it's worked. And I find that's you get a much more positive response than when they can actually see the data in their school. And then the next step would obviously be then, do we roll it out whole school now, or it might just be a case of going to more year groups. But I found that certainly over maybe 2 to 3 years, year 1 would be a pilot, year 2 you'd be going to maybe a number of year groups, and then finally up to the whole school. And then what you're looking at is, it isn't just the tools that are being delivered. Certainly from my experience, what I found was that the teachers started using these sort of interventions in the lessons. So for me, the gold standard is that staff not only just doing the very specific activities they've got with the tutor groups, but it becomes embedded into the delivery of all lessons, and it's part of the teaching and learning culture. I'm just conscious of time, Paul. Is that enough of an explanation now? I have got a couple of points on my experience that I've found through delivering that, if you want me to continue.
Yes, Steve, would you go through those points?
Yeah, sure. So that's how I generally explain how we would put the process into school. Just a few points that I've found from my experience of delivering this. First of all, and it's about this. My first point is about the staff understanding the models that they're actually working with, not only the staff but the pupils. And I found that the mental toughness model, one of the real benefits of it is actually, in some ways, its simplicity. So very straight away, as soon as you start working with the model, staff and pupils can understand the language that you're using and what you're talking about, because a lot of the language that's used within the mental toughness framework is actually used in everyday language. So you've got the everyday language, you've got the umbrella term that I've talked about, and for me that made it very straightforward to implement with both staff and pupils. And when you ask pupils at the end of the program, they can actually explain the constructs to you. So the language has passed across from the staff to pupils, which is actually quite an important point. The other really interesting point that we found is that, and we didn't plan this when I delivered this in school, but over the period that we were working with the pupils, we just happened to have put the staff through the MTQ 48, and we did pre and post testing with the staff, which was interesting. But what was surprising and a completely unintended consequence of the program that we were delivering is that the staff's mental toughness ended up developing more than the pupils' mental toughness. And part of the reason we think for that is that teachers in the UK anyway don't get any aspect of this included within their teacher training. So There's no work's done on resilience, growth mindset, mental toughness. You know, they just go into schools and they actually need mental toughness themselves, because if you know, anybody who works in the profession knows that it can be challenging. And they've started using the tools, the strategies that we're working with, and developing their self-awareness of their own mental toughness was actually, you know, really important. So the other thing that we found was that from the research I've done is that two things. One, the mental toughness questionnaire does clearly, from any of the data that I've looked at, it does clearly show that pupils who are performing better academically tend to have higher levels of mental toughness than those who aren't. So very quickly you can start to identify the very specific issues that you want to work with, you know, in terms of those particular pupils. And secondly, you can actually develop their mental toughness. So this is something that is, in my view anyway, in my experience, and we're seeing this across a lot of schools now, you can actually make a difference if you make a very specific focus on developing pupils' mental toughness. And I think that impact will not just help them academically, but one of the reasons we carried on doing it and were so keen to embed this was that we thought these are skills for life. These are employability skills. They'll help the pupils if they go on to work either in to the employment sector, or if they go on to higher education. Wherever they go, these are skills that are going to be extremely useful. So I hope that's okay, Paul. I've just tried to give a brief overview of how I'd embed it in some of the key points that we've found.
Thanks, Steve. I thought that was really thorough and practical, really, really useful. So thank you very much for that. I'm just wondering if you can stay on line for a second. Susie, do you have any sort of insights or comments or questions that you've got for Steve, perhaps about how we can use it in Australia, or anything else you feel would be relevant for our audience?
Yeah, sure, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you, Steve. That's a really great overview. I guess just for our audience, to give them a sense of where we're at in Australia, I met Doug and Peter Clough back in 2012, and we've been using it here in Australia, but broadly as part of our positive education offering that we have. So, and based on our own model, our raw model, which looks at resilience, achievement and well-being. So for us, the model is very user-friendly. For me, most importantly, it's scientifically based and scientifically valid. So it's, as Steve said, it's very easy to understand for staff. We've primarily used it with staff. At this stage, that's the primary area we have used it. One of the schools we've worked with created some lesson plans and piloted it with Year 10. They got some fairly encouraging results. But I believe there's such an opportunity here in Australia that it hasn't really been taken up yet. So I think today, Steve, your presentation has been really helpful. And I guess the approach that you've taken is the approach that's taken broadly in positive education. So just having a flick through on the participants, I can see there's a number of people that are, familiar faces and names to me. So in the positive education sector, we use the learn it, live it, teach it, embed it. So starting with the staff is absolutely crucial. And I also couldn't agree more that I often see schools just asking for the tools to take out to the students. And we really push back quite hard in terms of the staff understanding the theory and the model and applying it to themselves first. I did see there was a question here from someone asking about the relevance or suitability for primary school students. And Steve, you might refer to that, or Doug, in terms of the tool. But if you look at the primary interventions for it, where we're looking at thinking skills, anxiety management skills, attentional control skills, their skills, we've worked with, for example, Loreto Kirribilli a number of years ago, and if you were to walk over to the junior school there, the very young girls, Year 1, understand what growth mindset is, fixed mindset. They're using a lot of these interventions at that young age anyway. So I think there's definitely relevance to the earlier you start, the better.
Can I just put in something there, Susie, in relation to that? Yeah, because I think in the UK, the primary sector actually does quite a really good job of this. The fact that I think they're better than the secondary sector, but they have got the advantage of being with that pupil over here anyway the whole time, so they know that one student inside out. And the data we got from the independent schools study showed that as soon as they leave that transition, wherever a transition from one teacher to many teachers, you get a quite significant drop in mental toughness. But definitely, I think that the sooner you can start, the better. And I think from my experience of going into primary schools, the kids are more than open to it and ready for that sort of work. And one of the developments we've made over the last couple of years is the development of a JMTI. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, which is being used within the primary sector. And rather than the pupils complete the mental toughness questionnaire, this version encourages the staff to complete the questionnaire on the pupils. And they get a similar report, so it gives them their overall mental toughness scores and an overview of their particular class. And one of the feedback from that has been that it's really positive experience for the teacher. And we usually try and get them to do it, a few of them sat down together, to just go through the questions, thinking about their pupils individually. How are they in relation to all of the questions? And apparently the feedback has been just that experience itself of doing the questionnaire before they even see the data has been extremely useful, just to open their thinking. And the other factor is here that year 6 pupils, just before they move into the secondary ed, have got to complete a SATs examination now, which unfortunately is causing pupils here a huge amount of stress, because the teachers, although they don't often realise this, they're the ones who create it, unfortunately, because they're passing the stress on to the pupils. But there's a lot of work that can be done in that sector, and I think it's important that we look at that area as well.
Definitely. I think I just one other thing to say, which I usually say in my presentations, is my background as a clinical psychologist. I spent years working with people, and I also worked with senior high school students with anxiety disorders after the wheels had fallen off, and taught them skills like cognitive behavioural techniques, abdominal breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visualisation for treatment of phobias. And of course, Peter Clough, coming from a sports psych perspective, had used, as many sports psychs do, these same techniques for athletes and elite athletes. Similarly, in an executive coaching perspective, where I've worked for a long time, taught the same skills for people at the senior executive. But what we're missing is the majority of people in the bell curve have never learnt these life skills. And that's why there's such a strong imperative to get this out to as many people as possible. We may not prevent every episode of mental illness, but it's also about obviously helping people have better lives as well.
And one thing that you've said there, Susie, that I think is so important to this is that you said when the wheels have fallen off, and most schools here wait till that point, unfortunately. And then obviously the work to be done is much harder. What I found is that actually you can use the mental toughness questionnaire to identify who this group may well be, and then start working with them before those sort of situations go any deeper. So in my when I was working in the post-16 sector, and so they were arriving from 40 plus schools across Manchester, when the pupils when the students then completed the questionnaire, for example, I found that if a student was low on commitment and low on interpersonal confidence, they were potentially some that were going to leave without even speaking to us. So we were able to start working with them within 3 weeks of them arriving. So we anticipated the problems that were coming, and we practically cut out retention issues through being able to do that. So we knew those low interpersonal confidence students weren't going to come and speak to us about anything. So we got them and we partnered them up with people. We got them a mentor to start working with them straight away to ease the transition. Prior to that, it was all guesswork, and it was done quite badly. And we lost those pupils, and quite often they left. And we never knew what had happened to them because nobody even knew who they were. So it was tricky.
It's much more private.
And Susie, sorry, I have to cut you off there. I'm really sorry about this. I just wanted to introduce Steve Azamoudis, Steve, because I know you had some questions as well for Doug. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And a couple of questions I've seen pop up in the chair around, at what age? What's the youngest age? So we've seen the studies talk about grade 5. So is it around the 10 or 11-year mark that we'd be looking at doing this assessment? And then also talk us about the other end. So as they finish year 12 into university education, and anything you can share there with the transition from year 12 into university.
Okay, well, I think Steve's spoken about the early years element. The reason why we focused on age 10 and above is that the mental toughness questionnaire, the MTQ-48, works with pupils of that age. We find that you can probably take it down to 9-year-olds who will understand how to respond to the questionnaire. Below that, pupils might understand the items, the questions in the questionnaire, but they don't necessarily know how to respond to them. So what we've done is we've developed a kind of reverse version of the questionnaire, which is completed by staff or by people who know those pupils well. And we call that the JTI. It's a Junior Toughness Indicator. It's not a measure, we're careful, it's an indicator. But the research shows that it works, and it can give us a good handle on the mental toughness profile of young children. In fact, when you think about it, it works all the way down to year 1. Age 1. It can, once you've got somebody assessing an individual, you can do that at any age. And so we have this version that is steadily going out into the marketplace to be used by staff in junior education. I can't remember what your second. That's about transition into further or higher education. Yeah. What we do know is that we have a number of studies. We're actually working with 13 universities in the UK. Dropout or retention is a major issue in universities in the UK. On average, about 16.5% of students drop out in the first 10 weeks of a 3-year university program or a college program. Now, that's on average. If you're talking about Oxford and Cambridge, it's less than 1%. If you're talking about some of the lower ranked universities, believe it or not, it's up to 50%. So that causes havoc with every aspect of running that university. And of course, it creates a major problem for the economics of the university. So we've got these 13 projects. They're all focused on the concept of student retention. And what we've learned is, if you look at that 16.5%, about half of that is probably valid. It's people realizing they're on the wrong program or that university isn't for them. But half of it is down to simply not being able to deal with the change aspects of going to university or college. Either having to be taught or learn in a different way, because, as Steve said, in junior education, you have a very close relationship with the pupil. In secondary education, it's not quite as close, but it's still a pretty close relationship. Mostly teachers will know who the pupils are. You then get to university, and sometimes you might only meet the lecturer for an element of the program on 4 occasions, and you're sat in a room with 250 people. You're on your own. And if you can't manage that, it becomes a struggle. And so we know that about half of that 16% drop out for reasons that we can closely associate with mental toughness. And there's been a couple of programs run where we've introduced assessment, a minimal amount of development, sometimes no more than a half-a-day workshop, and we've seen retention improve, or the dropout rate plummet significantly. And there's an interesting question coming through about return on investment. In Scotland, we did a pilot, and the payback was something like 2 to 3 weeks. Something, even if they bought the test from us and didn't pay us for 4 weeks, they would get the money back before they paid for us. So,
fantastic. Thanks, Doug.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry?
Do you have any other questions, Steve? For Doug? No, Doug, do you have any questions that are coming through?
Well, I've noticed one question I really love, and that's about return on investment. I think 5 years ago, nobody would have heard anybody in the world of education talk about return on investment. Well, certainly not here. It was all about where can I get funding from? But now what we see is people beginning to be interested in this. Now, in the UK, in the last 2 or 3 years, I guess the same as any other country in the world, funding for all sorts of activities is beginning to get tight. And the Department of Work and Pensions and the Department of Education have begun to introduce something called social impact bonds. In other words, they're saying, well, there is funding available, we've got some money here, but we're only going to pay it on outcomes. And so in the past, you might have bid for a program and you say, well, this is what I'm going to do. And you might have evidenced it with things like happy sheets. The UK government and a number of other governments, I mean, we know that this is happening in Holland, are saying that's not good enough. There are very specific outcomes we want to measure. And if you want to take the risk, go out and do some development activity with young people and evidence it solidly that you've actually made that difference, we'll give you the money. And that's obviously a challenge for some organisations, and what we're seeing are social investors springing up who actually provide the funding to the schools or to the youth organisations, and then they recover it from the government. All of it at the moment in the UK is confined within the voluntary sector, so nobody's making a profit out of it. It's just a different way of providing funding. But we really like it because it is entirely outcome-based. So there are the two biggest social impact bonds in the UK are both mental toughness projects. And one of them has already completed, and it's the most successful social impact bond there has been so far. And that was it's a very specific project looking at 4,000 young people in Merseyside. And these people, the 4,000 young people, had been identified as having poor attendance. The average attendance was 68% in school. So obviously they weren't attending at school, they weren't going to achieve. The second thing was that the 4,000 had been assessed as unlikely to get a basic qualification on leaving school. And then the third element was they were unlikely to get into work because of their poor qualifications and poor background. And they were unlikely to go to university or college. So the government set 3 targets. One target was they would pay the partner that we worked with a sum of money for each pupil that achieved 95% attendance. They would then pay for each pupil that achieved a level 1 or level 2 qualification, and then they would pay for each pupil that either went on to further education or got into a job and stayed in either further education or a job for at least 6 months. The program has been hugely successful. The funder was an organisation called Bridges Ventures, and we know that they put up £2.8 million for the project. The Treasury gave them back £4.5 million, and the Treasury estimated the value to the UK government as somewhere around £10 million. So it's a very clear example of how this kind of thinking is coming in. The funding is there generally. We've got another project that's running with an organisation called London Youth Rowing. Curiously, they started off getting some money from the big lottery, which was just a conventional source of funding. But they began to use the mental toughness questionnaire to evidence the state, the mindset of people coming onto the programme, and the mindset of people coming off the programme. And they were able to show a very significant difference. It's a 2-year program, and they were able to show that that correlates with things like employability, and especially with moving on to further and higher education. That was so successful that PricewaterhouseCoopers gave them £800,000 purely because of the use of the mental toughness measure. They said, you know, we love the idea that you could evidence this kind of work. So we're beginning to see the issues of return on investment coming to the fore here. Because we've got something that measures something that's vital, we can make a big contribution to that. So the argument or the issue becomes a much easier thing to handle, whether you're dealing with social investors or philanthropists, and that is beginning to happen, or whether you're dealing with the governments. What we're able to do is say, this is where we can make that difference, and this is why it's important. And that seems to unlock the key to funding in an awful lot of places.
Doug, that's a great way to finish. I'm just very aware that we've ticked past the witching hour. So can I just thank you very much indeed? Unfortunately, we've got no time for questions, quite a few questions coming through. So if I can just thank all the participants and also say that we will respond to all your questions. If you have any questions that you want answering, please send them through to Susie or Steve, myself, or indeed to AQR in the UK. But thank you very much, Doug, and to Steve Oakes and to Claudine as well for getting up at the crack of dawn to speak to us in Australia. And also a huge thank you to Dr. Susie Green and Steve Azamoudis as well here in Australia. So thank you, and thank you to everybody who's listened. We really appreciate your support. So
thank you very much.
Afternoon.
Thank you for everybody. Dawn's just coming up now. We're just getting daylight.
Good to hear it. Thank you, Doug. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.